everyone. I was listening to the book of Mark the other day, and this short story in there stuck out to me in a way that it never had before. It's in Mark 2, and this is verses 1 through 5. And again he entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was noised that he was in the house. And straightway many were gathered together, insomuch that there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door, and he preached the word unto them. And they came unto him, bringing one sick of the palsy, which was borne of 4. And when they could not come nigh unto him for the press, they uncovered the roof where he was, and when they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of the palsy lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. And then in Mark 2, 9 through 12, it goes on to say, Whether is it easier to say to the sick of the palsy, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, Arise, and take up thy bed and walk? But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins, he saith to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, Arise, and take up thy bed, and go thy way into thine house. And immediately he arose, took up the bed, and went forth before them all, insomuch that they were all amazed, and glorified God, saying, We never saw it on this fashion. Now, I had to look up what the word palsy meant in this verse. So according to a website called Bible Study Tools, it means paralysis of some sort. And as I listened to this story, I listened to it on YouTube, it just came alive in my mind. As someone who suffers from a chronic, painful, inflammatory disease, I was able to put myself in the place of this person who was seeking a cure. I remember the days of living in so much pain every day, unable to do things that everyone around me was able to do. I remember dreaming of how happy I would be and how wonderful life would be if I were ever cured somehow. I imagined that nothing in my life would ever seem so bad again if I could just be rid of this pain and this disease. And if I had known any way to be healed, I would have done anything it took to receive that healing. And I just imagined that this man had some of the same thoughts that I did when I was suffering so badly. I imagine living in Capernaum and somehow hearing that this man had come to my town who could heal people. And I think of how desperate I would be to make my way to him. I imagine getting to the house where Jesus was and finding such a huge crowd around him that the paralyzed man and whoever had brought him, maybe they were family or friends, they probably couldn't even see Jesus through the crowd of people. If this man was like me, he would have wanted this healing more than he ever wanted anything in his life. Those who brought him probably tried to push their way through the crowd to get to Jesus. They probably begged the crowd to let them through, maybe asking nicely at first, and then maybe even eventually yelling at them in frustration. I can imagine the hope slipping away as they were unable to even come near Jesus. I can feel their urgency, knowing that it was now or never. One of them had an idea, though, a last resort. I can see them in desperation carrying him to the top of the house. Full of determination, they broke apart the roof and lowered the man on his bed down to Jesus. I try to imagine how the crowd would have reacted. They must have heard the commotion going on above them as the roof was taken off the house, and I wonder what they thought was happening. I imagine gasps and then silence as they watched the man being lowered down. The paralyzed man and those with him probably also wondered how Jesus and the crowd would react. Maybe they were afraid that Jesus would be mad and turn him away because of making such a display. They were probably even afraid of anger or trouble from the homeowner for breaking apart the roof. I imagine their relief when Jesus turned to the paralyzed man and said, Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. But there may have also been a moment of disappointment there. They had done all of this hoping for a cure, and probably not just for forgiveness of sins. But I imagine this disappointment turning into hope as he heard the words, Whether it is easier to say to the sick of the palsy, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, Arise, and take up thy bed and walk. This man was probably frozen in shock, wondering if this was too good to be true. Again he heard, I say unto thee, arise, and take up thy bed, and go thy way into thine house. And it says that he arose immediately. I don't know how long it had been since he could walk. I don't know if this was a condition that he had from birth, or if it was acquired later in life. In either case, I can only imagine the amazement and pure joy at being able to stand up and walk. It probably felt like a dream that he hoped he'd never wake from at first. As he continued the walk, he probably began to imagine all of the things that he'd be able to do now that he couldn't before. He would no longer have to depend on others to take care of him. No more laying around in sorrow, watching others live a life that he could only dream of. So many thoughts must have been going through his mind. Again, I imagine the reaction of the crowd. The verse says, they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, we never saw it on this fashion. They had never seen a healing like this before. I imagine everyone looking at each other in shock. Many were probably speculating amongst themselves about how this happened. Some probably weren't sure that they had really seen what they just saw. I imagine the energy of the crowd. It's always very powerful when a large group witnesses an unexplainable miracle. What an amazing experience it must have been to be there. And what's even more amazing is that this is only one tiny story among the many miracles that happened during the life of Jesus. As John 21:25 says, and there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. And just let us never forget what an awesome and amazing God we serve, and how amazing Jesus was. So I was trying to think of what lesson could be learned from this story. For me, the lesson is that God has a lot to offer us, but sometimes you have to be willing to tear off a roof in order to get it. Thank you for listening.